Right before they called my name to receive my diploma, my body gave out in front of the entire school, and while the doctors tried to reach my parents for hours, the only person who came for me was my grandfather. I still remember the sound of applause echoing through the high school gym that afternoon. Families filled every row of folding chairs, holding balloons, flowers, and phones ready to capture the moment their children walked across the stage. The air smelled faintly like cheap carnations and floor polish, and sunlight poured through the tall windows near the basketball court, turning everything gold for a few brief hours. Graduation day was supposed to feel like the beginning of my life. Instead, it became the day I finally understood who truly loved me. I had barely slept the night before. After finishing my shift at the diner just past midnight, I stayed awake another 3 hours finishing scholarship paperwork at the kitchen table while the rest of the house slept. My mother had reminded me twice that morning not to embarrass the family by looking tired in photos. My father barely looked up from his phone during breakfast. Most of their attention was on my younger brother Caleb, who had a baseball tournament that same weekend. Even on my graduation day, the conversation somehow revolved around him. Still, I told myself today would be different. Parents showed up for graduations. That's what families did. I wore the white dress my grandfather Walter bought me at Macy's 2 weeks earlier because Mom said she was too busy to go shopping with me. Grandpa had spent almost 2 hours helping me pick it out, pretending not to notice when I checked the price tags before touching anything. "You earned this day, sweetheart," he'd told me while holding up dresses under the fluorescent lights. "Don't spend it worrying about everybody else." I kept replaying those words in my head while sitting with the other seniors inside the gym. Around me, everyone laughed nervously and adjusted their caps for pictures. Teachers walked back and forth, organizing rows while the band warmed up near the bleachers. I scanned the audience 3 different times searching for my parents. My mother had texted 30 minutes earlier saying traffic was bad downtown, but they were trying to make it. Trying. That word sat heavy in my chest. Grandpa Walter was already there, though. I spotted him immediately near the middle row wearing the same navy suit he'd owned for years. He smiled the second he saw me looking. He even lifted his little disposable camera with both hands like it was the most important event in the world. I smiled back, even though something inside me felt strangely hollow. The principal had just started reading honors distinctions when my vision blurred around the edges. At first I thought it was nerves. My hands felt cold despite the June heat trapped inside the gymnasium. Then the room tilted slightly. The applause sounded far away. I remember gripping the edge of my chair. Someone beside me asked if I was okay, but before I could answer, a sharp ringing filled my ears. The next thing I knew, I was waking up inside an ambulance with an oxygen mask against my face and fluorescent lights flashing above me. My graduation gown was folded beside me. A paramedic kept asking me questions in a calm voice while checking my pulse. I tried to sit up immediately. "My graduation," I whispered. "Did I miss it?" The paramedic gave me a small sad smile. "Just rest for now, honey." At the hospital, doctors explained that exhaustion, dehydration, stress, and lack of sleep had pushed my body too far. One nurse asked if my parents were on the way. I nodded automatically because admitting the truth felt worse somehow. But an hour passed, then another. I stared at the hallway every time footsteps approached my room. Nurses made phone calls from the desk outside. I heard someone leave another voicemail. My mother never answered. Neither did my father. Around sunset, the door finally opened. Grandpa Walter walked in still wearing that old navy suit, except now his tie was crooked and his gray hair looked windblown like he'd rushed out of the house without thinking. His hands trembled when he saw me lying there in the hospital bed. "Emily," he said softly, his voice breaking just enough to make my chest ache. Then he crossed the room and held my hand like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. And in that moment, I realized the hospital hadn't been calling my parents anymore. They had been calling strangers. The hospital room became very quiet after the nurses finished checking my monitors for the night. Outside my window, the summer sky had turned dark blue, and the parking lot lights reflected against the glass like blurry stars. Grandpa Walter sat beside my bed in an uncomfortable plastic chair with his hands folded neatly in his lap. Every once in a while, he looked over at me just to make sure I was still awake. He had always done that ever since I was little, like he could not fully relax unless he knew I was okay. Around 8 o'clock, a nurse stepped into the room holding a clipboard. "Still no answer from your parents," she said carefully. almost like she regretted saying it out loud. We left another message. I nodded, even though my throat suddenly felt tight. Grandpa glanced down at the floor without saying anything. I think he was trying to protect me from seeing the anger in his face. They are probably busy, I whispered automatically. The words came out before I could stop them. I had spent most of my life making excuses for people who never showed up for me. The nurse gave me a soft, sympathetic smile before leaving the room again. After she closed the door, silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable silence, just heavy, the kind that says everything without speaking. Grandpa finally leaned forward and adjusted the blanket near my shoulder like he used to when I stayed overnight at his house during thunderstorms. You do not have to defend them all the time, Emily, he said quietly. I stared at the ceiling tiles above my bed. One of them had a small water stain in the corner shaped like a cloud. I guess I just thought today would matter to them, I admitted. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. Grandpa exhaled slowly through his nose. Sweetheart, some people get so used to someone being strong that they forget strong people can break too. I felt tears burn behind my eyes, but I blinked them away quickly. Crying always made me uncomfortable. Growing up in our house taught me that emotions were inconvenient things that needed to be handled privately. If I got upset, my mother called me dramatic. If I needed help, my father reminded me how independent I was. So I learned to stay quiet. I learned to solve my own problems. I learned how to become invisible while still making everyone else comfortable. Grandpa was the only person who ever noticed the effort behind it. He noticed when I skipped meals during finals week. He noticed when my sneakers had holes near the soles. He noticed when I smiled too quickly after someone disappointed me. When I was 14 and did not make the varsity volleyball team, my parents forgot I even had tryouts that day. Grandpa drove 40 minutes after work just to bring me chocolate milkshakes and sit beside me at the park until sunset. He never forced me to talk. He just stayed. That was his gift. He stayed. A little after 9 o'clock, my phone finally buzzed on the tray table beside me. My heart jumped before I even looked at the screen. Mom. I answered too quickly. Hi, I said softly. Emily, my mother said with a sigh already in her voice. We just got the messages. Are you all right now? I looked over at Grandpa sitting beside me in the dim hospital light. I think so. Well, that is good, she replied. Your father and I are at Caleb's tournament hotel 2 hours away, and tomorrow is his championship game. We figured there is not much we can do tonight if the doctors already treated you. I swallowed hard. Right. Try to rest, she said distractedly. And please do not scare everyone like this again. Then the line disconnected. I stared at my phone for several seconds after the call ended. No apology. No panic. No promise to come see me. Just inconvenience. Slowly, I lowered the phone into my lap. Grandpa did not ask what she said. Maybe he already knew. He simply reached over and squeezed my hand gently while the heart monitor beside me continued its steady, quiet rhythm through the dark. I stayed in the hospital overnight for observation, and by morning the exhaustion in my body felt deeper than simple tiredness. It felt like every year of trying too hard had finally settled into my bones all at once. Grandpa Walter slept in the chair beside my bed with his arms crossed tightly over his chest and his glasses slightly crooked. At some point during the night, a nurse had draped a thin blanket over him. When I opened my eyes around 6:30, the sky outside the window was pale gray, and the first thing I saw was him waking up the second I moved. You hungry? He asked softly, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Hospital pancakes are terrible, but I can probably sneak you something better. I laughed quietly for the first time since graduation day. My throat still hurt from dehydration, and my chest felt heavy, but hearing his voice grounded me somehow. You always try to fix things with pancakes, I said. Grandpa smiled faintly. Worked when you were 7. That made another memory rise up before I could stop it. I was 7 years old at my elementary school winter concert wearing a paper snowflake pinned crookedly to my sweater. Every other child had parents in the audience waving cameras and flowers from the seats. I kept searching for mine until the music teacher finally touched my shoulder gently and said, Sweetheart, we are starting. Mom had promised she would come after work. Dad said he would try to leave his office early. Neither showed up. I remember standing on stage under bright cafeteria lights pretending not to notice the empty seats near the back row. But halfway through the concert, the side door opened, and Grandpa Walter hurried in carrying snow on his coat's shoulders and breathing hard like he had run from the parking lot. He still had his mechanic uniform on from work. He clapped louder than anyone after every song. Later, he took me to get hot chocolate, even though it was already past my bedtime. "You were the best singer there," he told me while stirring whipped cream into my cup. I barely heard anybody else. At the time, I thought all grandparents acted like that. It took years for me to realize most children did not spend their lives being rescued emotionally by one exhausted old man trying to make up for everybody else. Around 9 in the morning, my father finally called. I answered because some part of me still wanted him to sound worried. "Hey kiddo," he said casually, like we were discussing the weather. "Your mother said you were feeling better." I stared at the hospital bracelet around my wrist. "I guess so." "Good," he replied. "You really need to take better care of yourself. Stress like this is not healthy." I waited for him to say they were driving back. I waited for him to ask if I needed anything. Instead, I heard noise in the background from the baseball field and my brother laughing nearby. "Caleb is up next at bat," Dad continued. "He has scouts watching today. Big opportunity for him." Of course he did. Everything in our family somehow rotated around Caleb like planets around the sun. His games, his schedules, his future. Even now, lying in a hospital bed less than 24 hours after collapsing, I could already feel myself shrinking quietly back into the background where everyone seemed most comfortable keeping me. "Right," I whispered. "Tell him good luck." "That is my girl," Dad said warmly, almost relieved I was being easy again. Always understanding. After the call ended, I set my phone face down beside me and looked toward the window before Grandpa could see the expression on my face. Outside, a helicopter passed slowly across the morning sky above the city. People were beginning normal days. Traffic moved. Coffee shops opened. Life continued forward like nothing had happened. But something inside me felt different now. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just tired. Tired in a way I had never allowed myself to admit before. The doctors discharged me later that afternoon with strict instructions to rest for at least a week, drink more water, eat regular meals, and avoid stress whenever possible. I almost laughed when the nurse said that last part. Avoid stress. As if stress was some loud, obvious thing you could simply walk around like a puddle on the sidewalk. The truth was, stress in my life had always been quiet. It looked like working double shifts after school because I did not want Grandpa paying for my college applications alone. It looked like studying until 2 in the morning because 1B on my report card felt like proof I was failing as a daughter. It looked like smiling through every disappointment before anybody else could feel uncomfortable about causing it. Grandpa drove me home in silence, except for soft country music playing from the radio. His old Ford pickup rattled slightly every time we stopped at a red light, and the air conditioner barely worked against the June heat. Still, sitting beside him felt safer than sitting anywhere else in the world. Halfway home, he glanced over at me carefully. "You do not have to go back there tonight if you do not want to," he said. I knew exactly what he meant. Home did not always feel like home anymore. Not for a long time. "Mom will think I am overreacting," I replied quietly. Grandpa tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Emily, collapsing from exhaustion at 18 years old, is not overreacting." I stared out the passenger window at rows of suburban houses passing slowly beside us. Perfect lawns, basketball hoops in driveways, American flags hanging from porches. From the outside, families always looked simpler than they really were. "I just do not want to make things harder," I whispered. Grandpa let out a tired sigh that sounded older than I had ever heard before. "Sweetheart, when exactly does somebody start making things easier for you?" I did not answer because I honestly did not know. When we pulled into my parents' driveway, Caleb's baseball gear was scattered across the garage floor like usual. Sports bags, cleats, water bottles, evidence of the person our entire household revolved around. Inside, my mother stood at the kitchen counter scrolling through her phone while reheating leftover pasta in the microwave. She looked up briefly when I walked in. "Oh good, you are home," she said. "How are you feeling?" "Better." "That is good." Her attention returned to her screen almost immediately. Dad sat at the dining room table reviewing baseball tournament photos on his laptop. Neither of them stood up to hug me. Neither asked what the hospital had been like. Caleb finally appeared from upstairs wearing headphones around his neck. "You passed out pretty hard, huh?" he joked lightly while grabbing a soda from the refrigerator. Coach said, "Stress can mess people up." I forced a small smile because everybody else was acting like this should somehow feel normal. Grandpa Walter stayed near the front door watching the room quietly. I could always tell when he was disappointed in people because he became very still. "Emily needs rest," he said firmly after a moment. "The doctors were very clear about that." Mom waved a hand dismissively. "Of course she does. We already told her not to push herself so hard." Something inside me tightened painfully at those words. Not because they were cruel. Honestly, cruelty would have been easier to understand. It was the casualness that hurt most. The complete lack of awareness. Like my collapse had been a scheduling inconvenience instead of a warning sign. I went upstairs slowly and closed my bedroom door behind me. The room looked exactly the same as it had the morning before graduation. Textbooks stacked beside my bed. Scholarship papers scattered across my desk. My graduation cap resting carefully near the window. For a long moment, I just stood there listening to the faint sounds of my family downstairs laughing about Caleb's game highlights while the house carried on without me. Then my phone buzzed softly in my hand. A text from Grandpa Walter. "You never have to earn love from the right people." I read that sentence 3 times before sitting quietly on the edge of my bed with tears finally slipping down my face where nobody else could see them. The next few days passed quietly, but it was the kind of quiet that makes you notice things you used to ignore. I stayed mostly in my room because every conversation downstairs somehow exhausted me more than the hospital had. Mom kept reminding me to drink electrolyte water. Dad occasionally knocked once on my door before asking if I was doing okay now. Caleb spent most of his time talking loudly on video calls about college scouts and summer tournaments. Life inside the house moved around me instead of toward me. It was strange realizing how easy it was for people to continue without you once they were used to your silence. On Tuesday afternoon, Grandpa Walter showed up carrying grocery bags filled with soup, crackers, fresh fruit, and 3 containers of peach yogurt because he remembered it was my favorite when I was little. Mom thanked him distractedly while sorting laundry in the living room. "You really do not have to spoil her," she said with a laugh. "Emily has always been the easiest kid to raise." Grandpa looked at her for a long moment before answering. Easy children are usually the ones getting overlooked. The room became awkwardly quiet after that. Mom folded another towel without looking up. "Well, Caleb simply needed more attention growing up," she replied carefully. "You know how competitive sports are." Grandpa did not argue. He just nodded once and carried the grocery bags upstairs to my room himself. After he left that evening, I kept thinking about what Mom had said. The easiest kid to raise. I realized that was probably how they had always seen me. Not as a daughter who needed comfort or protection or reassurance. Just someone low maintenance. Someone who handled things alone. The strange part was that I had helped create that version of myself because it felt safer than disappointment. I thought about all the little moments over the years that slowly taught me not to ask for much. In middle school, when my art teacher selected one of my paintings for a regional competition, Mom forgot to come to the exhibit because Caleb had batting practice. Freshman year, when I won academic honors, Dad missed the ceremony because one of Caleb's games went into extra innings. Every time it happened, they apologized casually afterward and promised they were proud of me. And every single time, I smiled and told them it was okay. Eventually, they stopped apologizing at all. That night, I opened my laptop and started sorting through old school photos for graduation announcements. Somewhere between folders, I found a picture from sophomore year that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. It was from the science fair. I stood beside my project display holding a second-place ribbon while Grandpa Walter grinned proudly next to me in his old brown jacket. Behind us, rows of parents filled the cafeteria. My parents were not there. I remembered pretending not to care. Because Grandpa had shown up carrying a milkshake and 2 cheeseburgers afterward. Second place just means there is room to surprise everybody later, he told me while we sat in his truck eating fries from the bag. Looking at the photo now, I noticed something I had missed before. Grandpa looked exhausted even back then. There were dark circles under his eyes, grease stains near his cuffs from work, and lines around his smile that deepened every year. Yet somehow he still kept showing up for me when the people actually responsible for me could not be bothered. Around midnight, my bedroom door opened softly. Dad stepped inside holding a mug of coffee. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" he asked. I nodded cautiously. He lowered himself into my desk chair and looked around the room awkwardly like a guest instead of a parent. "Your mother and I have been talking," he began. "We think maybe you put too much pressure on yourself." I stared at him quietly. "Did you ever wonder why?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Dad blinked slightly, caught off guard. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed and rubbed a hand across his jaw. Emily, not everything is about favoritism. I looked down at the science fair photo still glowing softly on my laptop screen. Grandpa's tired smile reflected faintly in the dark room. And for the first time in my life, I realized maybe I was finally too exhausted to keep pretending everything was normal. Dad stayed in my room for another minute after saying that, but the conversation never really recovered. He looked uncomfortable sitting there beside my desk, like he had wandered into somebody else's life by mistake. Finally, he stood up slowly and cleared his throat. Your mother worries about you, Emily, he said before leaving. I almost asked him what exactly she worried about, because most days it felt like my role in the family was making sure nobody had to worry about me at all. But I stayed quiet. After he closed the door, I looked back at the science fair photo glowing on my laptop screen. Grandpa Walter's smile looked proud and tired at the same time. The kind of tiredness that comes from carrying emotional weight nobody else notices. I did not sleep much that night. Around 2 in the morning, I heard thunder outside and rain beginning to hit the roof in soft, steady waves. I walked downstairs for water and found Grandpa sitting alone at the kitchen table in the dark. A small lamp above the stove cast a pale yellow light across the room. He looked up immediately when he saw me. Could not sleep either? He asked gently. I shook my head and sat across from him. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the refrigerator hummed quietly behind us. Then Grandpa folded his hands together carefully and looked down at the table. I need to tell you something I should have said years ago, he said. Something in his voice made my stomach tighten. Your parents love you, Emily, he continued slowly. But somewhere along the way, they started depending on you being the strong one all the time. And the stronger you became, the less they noticed how much you were carrying. I stared at the steam rising from the mug of tea beside him. Caleb always needed more, I said automatically, repeating the explanation I had heard my entire life. Grandpa gave a sad smile. That is true, but needing more attention does not mean deserving all of it. The rain outside grew heavier. I felt strangely frozen listening to him say things out loud that I had spent years trying not to think about too deeply. Grandpa sighed quietly before continuing. Your father was so proud of how independent you were when you were little. You tied your own shoes early. You did your homework without reminders. You never threw tantrums. Your mother used to tell everybody how easy you were compared to Caleb. He paused for a moment. But children are not supposed to earn love by being convenient. Something about that sentence cracked open inside my chest. Not dramatically, just quietly, like ice slowly breaking apart under pressure. Grandpa looked older sitting there in the kitchen light than I had ever noticed before. His silver hair had thinned over the years, and deep lines framed his eyes from decades of hard work and worry. I should have pushed harder, he admitted. Softly. There were times I almost said something. Birthdays they forgot. School events they skipped. The way you always smiled afterwards so nobody would feel guilty. I kept thinking they would realize it themselves eventually. I swallowed hard. Maybe I really was asking for too much. Grandpa looked up sharply then. Emily. His voice carried a firmness I rarely heard. You collapsed because your body finally gave up trying to carry disappointment quietly. That is not asking for too much. Tears filled my eyes again before I could stop them. I hated crying in front of people, but somehow it felt different with him. Safer. I just wanted them to choose me once, I whispered. Grandpa's expression broke completely at those words. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his weathered one. I know, he said softly. And sweetheart, that was never too much to want. Upstairs, I could hear faint laughter from Caleb's room, where he was probably still awake talking to friends online about baseball and college recruiters and summer plans. The rest of the house slept peacefully around us while Grandpa and I sat quietly at the kitchen table, surrounded by rain and things nobody in our family had ever been brave enough to say out loud before. Something shifted quietly inside me after that conversation with Grandpa Walter. Not all at once. There was no dramatic argument downstairs or sudden explosion of emotions. It was smaller than that. Quieter. Like finally setting down a heavy bag you forgot you had been carrying for years. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual and sat by my bedroom window watching sunlight spread slowly across the neighborhood. Sprinklers clicked softly on nearby lawns while people left for work carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Everything looked ordinary outside, but inside me, something felt unfamiliar. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to figure out how to make other people choose me. Around breakfast, Mom knocked lightly on my door. "You should come downstairs," she said. "Your father made pancakes." Normally, I would have rushed to accept any small gesture that resembled attention. Normally, I would have treated crumbs like a feast. But that morning, I simply looked up from the college orientation packet spread across my bed and said, "I am okay up here." She hesitated slightly, almost surprised by my answer. "All right then." After she left, I noticed my hands trembling a little. Not from fear, from unfamiliarity. Saying no felt strange after spending years making myself available for everybody else. Later that afternoon, I went through old emails from colleges while organizing scholarship documents. One message caught my attention again. Northeastern University in Boston had offered me a partial academic scholarship months earlier, but I had nearly declined because Mom said staying closer to home would make more sense financially for the family. At the time, I agreed immediately. Caleb's travel baseball expenses were already overwhelming my parents, and I did not want to become another burden. But now, sitting alone at my desk, I reread the acceptance letter carefully. The words felt different this time. Not impossible, just distant. Like a life I had convinced myself I did not deserve. Grandpa called around 3 o'clock asking if I wanted to drive with him to the hardware store. He always found excuses to spend time together without making it obvious. During the drive, sunlight flickered through the windshield while old country songs played softly on the radio. "You feeling stronger today?" he asked casually. "A little." He nodded once. "Good." A few minutes passed before I spoke again. "Do you think leaving home makes somebody selfish?" Grandpa glanced at me briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "Depends," he said carefully. "Are they leaving because they stopped loving people, or because they finally started loving themselves too?" I looked down at my hands folded in my lap. Nobody had ever framed it that way before. At the hardware store, Grandpa spent 20 minutes debating between 2 different garden hoses with an employee while I wandered nearby, pretending to browse flower seeds. An older woman beside me smiled warmly. "Your dad seems sweet," she said casually, nodding toward Grandpa. I opened my mouth to correct her automatically, then stopped. Something about the assumption tightened my chest unexpectedly. Because in every way that mattered emotionally, Grandpa had been the closest thing I ever had to a real parent. "Yeah," I said softly instead. "He really is." That evening, Dad knocked on my bedroom door again after dinner. "Your mother said you barely ate downstairs," he began carefully. "Emily, if you are upset about graduation still, you have to understand things were complicated that weekend." I looked at him standing awkwardly in my doorway, trying once again to smooth over discomfort without truly seeing it. "I know," I replied quietly. "Everything is always complicated when it comes to me." His expression shifted slightly at that, like he finally heard something underneath the words. But before he could answer, Caleb shouted from downstairs asking Dad to help him review baseball footage online. Dad glanced toward the hallway immediately. Reflex. Habit. Priority. "We will talk later," he said quickly before leaving. I listened to his footsteps disappear downstairs toward Caleb's room while silence settled back around mine. Then I turned toward my laptop again and reopened the Northeastern Scholarship email with steady hands. 2 weeks later, an envelope from Northeastern University arrived in the mailbox with my name printed across the front in dark blue letters. I stood in the kitchen holding it while Mom rushed around packing snacks for Caleb's tournament road trip. "Can you put that with the other mail?" she asked distractedly without even looking up. For a second, I almost did exactly what she said. Set it down quietly. Open it later alone in my room like every other important moment in my life. But something stopped me. "It is from Northeastern," I said carefully. Mom paused briefly while sealing a plastic container. "All right, the Boston school." That was all. No excitement. No curiosity. No questions. Just another thing passing through the background of the day. Dad entered the kitchen carrying Caleb's equipment bag over his shoulder. "Ready to go, champ?" he called toward the stairs. Then he noticed the envelope in my hands. "What is that?" "Financial aid update," I answered. He nodded distractedly. "Good luck with it." A few minutes later they were gone, tires rolling down the driveway, while Caleb laughed loudly from the back seat. I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the envelope until Grandpa Walter knocked softly on the front door 30 minutes later, carrying coffee and a paper bag from the bakery downtown. "I had a feeling today mattered," he said with a small smile. We sat together at the kitchen table while sunlight spread across the hardwood floors in warm golden squares. My hands shook slightly, opening the envelope. Inside was a revised scholarship offer. Full tuition, housing assistance, academic honors placement. I read the letter twice because the words did not feel real at first. Boston suddenly stopped looking like a distant dream and started looking like an actual future waiting for me somewhere beyond this house. Grandpa read over my shoulder quietly before removing his glasses. His eyes looked watery. "Emily," he whispered softly, "you did this." I laughed nervously because part of me still expected somebody to explain why it was not practical or why it would inconvenience everyone else somehow. "It is really far," I admitted. Grandpa leaned back in his chair. "Maybe far is exactly what you need." The words settled deep inside me. That evening, Mom and Dad returned home exhausted from the tournament. Caleb had apparently played well enough to attract attention from another scout, and the entire house buzzed with excitement around his future again. During dinner, I finally gathered enough courage to mention the scholarship. "Northeastern offered full tuition," I said quietly while passing the salad bowl. For a brief moment, silence fell across the table. Dad looked genuinely surprised. "Full tuition? And housing assistance," I added. Caleb let out a low whistle. "Boston is expensive. That is huge." Mom smiled quickly, but something about it looked strained around the edges. "Well, that certainly changes things." I waited for more. For pride, excitement, questions about orientation or classes or plans. Instead, Dad cleared his throat awkwardly. "That is impressive, Emily." Impressive, like I had completed a project at work instead of changing my entire future. Still, this time something inside me did not collapse from the disappointment. I simply nodded and continued eating. Later that night, while folding laundry upstairs, I overheard my parents arguing quietly in their bedroom down the hall. "Boston is too far away," Mom whispered sharply. "We barely see her now as it is." Dad sighed heavily. "Karen, she earned this opportunity." "I know that," Mom replied. "I just did not think she would actually leave." I stood frozen beside the hallway linen closet, holding a stack of towels against my chest. Not because the words hurt. Strangely, they did not. For the first time, I heard the truth underneath them clearly. They had spent so many years assuming I would always stay emotionally close no matter how little they gave back. Like loyalty was simply part of my personality instead of something fragile that could eventually wear down. I returned quietly to my room and sat beside the window looking out at the dark neighborhood. Somewhere downstairs, Grandpa Walter laughed softly at something on television while the washing machine hummed steadily through the house. For the first time in a very long while, the future no longer felt like something I had to survive. It felt like something I could finally belong to. August arrived faster than I expected. Suddenly the house filled with cardboard boxes, packing tape, and piles of folded clothes spread across my bedroom floor. Every day brought another reminder that I was leaving. College orientation forms, dorm supply lists, shipping confirmations. Mom kept saying things like, "I cannot believe summer is already over." But there was still a strange distance between us that never fully closed after graduation. Sometimes I caught her standing quietly in my doorway watching me pack with an expression I could not quite read. Regret, maybe, or confusion, like she was only now realizing I had an entire inner life she never bothered to notice before. Grandpa Walter helped me shop for dorm supplies the weekend before move-in day. We walked slowly through crowded store aisles comparing desk lamps and comforters while exhausted parents pushed overloaded carts around us. At one point, I noticed Grandpa checking price tags carefully when he thought I was not looking. "You already did enough?" I told him softly while reaching for my wallet. He looked almost offended. "Emily Carter, let me buy my granddaughter a microwave." I laughed quietly, and for a moment, everything felt light again. Safe. Near the checkout line, another family stood beside us arguing over which mini refrigerator their son wanted for his dorm room. The mother kept fussing over snacks and laundry detergent, while the father teased his son about growing up too fast. Watching them used to make me ache with jealousy. But standing beside Grandpa that afternoon, I realized something important. Love does not always arrive in the form people expect. Sometimes it looks like an old man comparing prices on storage bins because he wants you to feel prepared for your future. The night before I left for Boston, Dad knocked softly on my bedroom door, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. It reminded me painfully of something Grandpa would do. Dad sat carefully on the edge of my desk chair and looked around the room that no longer looked like mine. Half the shelves were empty already. I keep thinking about the hospital, he admitted quietly after a long silence. I looked down at the steam rising from my mug. Dad. No, let me finish. His voice sounded rougher than usual. I think somewhere along the way, your mother and I convinced ourselves that because you never demanded attention, you did not need it. He swallowed hard before continuing. And I am starting to realize how unfair that was. I stayed very still because a part of me had imagined hearing those words for years. But strangely, they did not heal me the way I once thought they would. Some wounds close slowly after too much time passes. I didn't need it, I said softly. Dad nodded immediately, eyes lowering toward his hands. I know that now. Downstairs, I could hear Grandpa laughing quietly at a television commercial while Mom loaded the dishwasher in the kitchen. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life continuing around an extraordinary conversation that came years too late. Early the next morning, we loaded my boxes into Grandpa's old pickup truck because Dad's SUV was packed with Caleb's baseball equipment for another tournament that weekend. Somehow that felt painfully symbolic. Before leaving, Mom hugged me tightly in the driveway for longer than usual. Call us when you get there, she whispered. Dad kissed the top of my head awkwardly and told me he was proud of me. Caleb even promised to visit Boston someday after baseball season. But it was Grandpa Walter who drove me the entire 4 hours to campus with one hand steady on the wheel and a cooler full of sandwiches packed beside us. When we finally pulled into the university parking lot, students and families crowded the sidewalks carrying boxes into brick dorm buildings under the bright September sun. Grandpa helped me unpack every last thing into my tiny dorm room before standing quietly near the doorway with his car keys in hand. You okay, sweetheart? He asked softly. I looked around the room slowly. New city, new life, new beginning. Then I looked back at the man who showed up every single time my world felt unsteady. Yeah, I answered honestly. I think I finally am. Grandpa smiled, eyes shining slightly behind his glasses. And as I hugged him goodbye beneath the sound of distant church bells echoing across campus, I realized something that would stay with me long after that day. The people who truly love you do not make you beg to matter. They simply show up.